Hi, can you hear me well?
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Welcome. You may introduce yourself and you may begin.
Thank you, Madam Secretary, and thank you for the technical team that helped set up this video conference. Good afternoon, Chairperson Scott, Vice Chair Lasner, and Commissioners. My name is Brenda Bouchette, and I'm here to represent the members of the British Columbia Broadband Association. Our members are internet service providers across British Columbia who offer cable, fixed wireless, and wholesale services to communities across the province. I myself am an employee of ABC Communications. We've asked to appear today because we think that small carriers have an important part to play in the Canadian telecommunications market. We bring competition to consumers across Canada, and we bring high-speed services to rural and remote communities. I'm going to touch on 4 points today. I'll speak about our vision of the telecommunications market in Canada. I'll explain our support for the hybrid mobile network operator model proposed by Cogeco, and I'll address a few points raised by the Competition Bureau as well as some other interveners. Finally, I'll ask the Commission for a ruling that fosters broad-based investment in telecommunications infrastructure across Canada. Our members foresee that in the coming years, more and more Canadians will connect to the internet using only a single mobile connection. This trend could harm service providers that cannot offer any form of mobile service, and so it will harm competition. We also think that the architecture of 5G will permit more flexibility in the way that service providers interconnect with each other to reach customers. The 5G architecture has the potential to support a variety of investors in the network infrastructure. Companies that are not mobile carriers today will invest in this infrastructure if we have a pathway to participate in the market. The BCBA sees opportunities to participate in the market through this hybrid model, particularly in communities that are underserved, rural, and remote. For example, a regional provider could install a cell site in the community without cellular service or with poor coverage. People in the community could buy handsets and services from the local carrier, and they could roam onto other networks when they travel. Visitors to the area could roam onto the local network. If small companies can construct cell sites that are part of the national 5G network, then we will expand cellular service in underserved communities. The BCBA thinks that Cogeco's hybrid model sets out a clear path for a broad base of small and medium-sized regional companies to invest in telecommunications infrastructure. The hybrid framework would stimulate investment into the infrastructure that is needed the most, whether that is backhaul, fixed access, or mobile access. It would encourage a broad base of companies to invest by permitting investment at a scale that matches business volumes. For small companies in particular, a hybrid model would permit entry into the mobile market if we can purchase wholesale and roaming access through an intermediary, rather than dealing directly with a large national carrier. The hybrid model would provide smaller regional companies with a regulatory framework that permits growth without facing barriers to entry and new barriers at each phase or increment of investment. The Competition Bureau accurately identified many of the challenges and the various barriers to entry and growth that small and medium-sized telecommunications companies face today. We think that the Cogeco hybrid model allows companies to overcome these barriers and addresses the dual goals of increasing both retail competition and facilities-based competition. We think that the proposal to introduce a temporary framework does not provide a strong incentive for market entry and investment. In rural areas in particular, where it is difficult to achieve a substantial business volume, the use of penalties is a strong disincentive to market entry. And of course, as the Bureau and many others have pointed out, constructing a mobile network requires spectrum. It is extremely difficult for small or regional companies to acquire mobile spectrum. If there is not enough spectrum for competitors, then mandated permanent access to the radio networks of incumbents is the only route to mobile competition. Wholesale and roaming access to mobile networks will support investment into telecommunications facilities in the hybrid model. If Canada is to have a broad base of telecommunications companies investing in infrastructure and bringing mobile competition to Canadians, then the Commission needs to ensure a clear and timely path to wholesale and roaming access. As the Competition Bureau noted, it is challenging for competitors to negotiate any access to any incumbent's facilities. However, cost-based tariffs are difficult to get right. They're complicated to administer, they take a long time to determine, and they produce wholesale rates that we believe are frequently too high. So, we think that a negotiated wholesale rate is the best choice, but these need to be accompanied by a strong regulatory backstop. And this regulatory backstop will need to be stringent in order to be effective. We think that it would be appropriate for the Commission to target a certain level of wholesale business, for example, by mandating that a minimum percentage of mobile revenues or traffic should be wholesale revenues or traffic. A timeline for successful negotiations should also be mandated. A competitor should be able to go from a request to a service launch in about 18 months. If small and regional providers have a high expectation of successful wholesale and roaming access, then these companies will have a strong incentive to invest in infrastructure in our home markets. In closing, I would like to reiterate that regional facilities-based providers have invested extensively in telecommunications infrastructure, and we are a significant source of potential investment into mobile networks. If we have a regulatory framework that allows us to take advantage of mobile opportunities, we will build more infrastructure and expand cellular coverage in rural areas and increase competition in markets across Canada. For a regulatory framework to support investment, it must create opportunities in the near future, it must provide operators with business certainty, and it must induce large carriers to negotiate with smaller competitors. We think that the Cogeco hybrid proposal is an excellent model to start with to create a framework that brings more services and competition to Canadian consumers. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. Commissioner Levy.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Hi. Let's talk a little bit to begin with about competition in the marketplace. Can you explain whether you consider the introduction of the unlimited plans by the national network operators in the summer of last year? Do you consider that to represent a significant development in terms of competition in the mobile wireless market?
I would say so. I think, apologies, I'm getting some feedback on my audio. I do think that those plans appear to be motivated by the competition that was brought in by Cogeco, thank you, the audio is repaired, and the other mobile competitors.
If the Commission were to mandate wholesale MVNO access, what impact do you expect them to have on the Canadian marketplace, and in what kind of time frame?
The impact would certainly depend on how the Commission decides to mandate that. But I think that if MVNOs are enabled at wholesale rates that are advantageous, then I think that we would start to see service launches of new operators within the course of the year from the mandate of the Commission.
Do you have any notion of what the margin should be on those wholesale rates and access?
We currently have no members who are mobile carriers, so I could not say. We do have members who provide wholesale wireline services, and the margins are quite low on those. I do not have that number right now. I could undertake to provide you some feedback on that.
I was more interested on the wireless side, but just in case you had a notion of what that might be. Do you know whether any of your members have ever approached any of the main network operators in order to negotiate MVNO-like access or any other arrangement to provide mobile wireless service?
I am not aware of any members who have approached any operators for MVNO access. Our members are generally quite small, and that would be an extremely intimidating prospect, even if they did know where to start. I will, though, mention the company I work for, ABC Communications, has negotiated access to some mobile spectrum from Rogers that is published on the ISED website.
And what are you using that for?
So this arrangement is quite recent. It covers 5 communities that are very small and somewhat remote. We have only recently begun our technical deployment in one of those communities. So it's still at early stages of commercial development.
And what was the negotiation process like in that? Do you have some firsthand knowledge of what that was, how that negotiation process unfolded?
It unfolded over the course of, I would say, a couple of years. It was not. I will say that our partner Rogers was not averse to these discussions. It was not an unpleasant negotiation process. It was conducted in normal commercial terms. So in the end, we're pleased with the outcome of this negotiation.
In your intervention, you stated that fixed wireless and cable operators are not able to offer mobile services, and that with very limited access to spectrum or roaming agreements, smaller companies face insurmountable barriers to entry in the mobile market. Well, that said, you've managed to carve off a little piece of it.
We've managed a small piece in a small area, yes.
So a number of you and some others have managed to launch wireless service. What does the ability for these providers to launch mobile wireless operations say about spectrum as a barrier to entry?
Spectrum is a tremendous barrier to entry. The low-band spectrum is, for small carriers, out of the question. It's really off the table. We have interest in following what happens with the millimeter wave spectrum, the upper bands of spectrum, which we anticipate will be part of the 5G ecosystem. And we anticipate that there will be perhaps more of that available, a large quantity, and it might be available in smaller regional tiers for at auction or for purchase, or however it's administered by ISED. This is not appropriate for large-scale rural coverage, but it could be quite appropriate for town centers, you know, the main center of a small town. This could be an opportunity. In the mid-band spectrum range, there are some companies, such as the company I work for, ABC Communications, that own some mid-band spectrum. We own spectrum in the 3.5 gigahertz range. Xplornet, of course, has extensive holdings in that same band. There may be some avenues to access for spectrum. However, currently the way spectrum is distributed at auction in large tier sizes makes it very difficult, well, makes it impossible for a small carrier to access spectrum at auction. And notwithstanding our success with Rogers in these small, and I'll say again, these are very small communities that are somewhat remote, it is challenging. It would be challenging, I'm sure, for us to negotiate access to spectrum in less remote communities.
If your members were to become MVNOs in Canada, what measures do you believe they'd have to take to ensure that their wireless plans would be readily available to vulnerable populations, such as seniors and low-income households?
Because our members are very small companies, we live in these same communities that we work in, and we have close relationships not only with our customers, but with the communities our customers live in, the First Nations communities, the municipal councils, the regional districts, the local levels of government. So we not only respond to those, to our customers, but we also receive a great deal of pressure from the regional levels of government that we work closely with. And if we are not providing adequate levels of service or affordability, we hear about that on multiple fronts. It is important to provide accessible packages. In many of our communities, people either have low levels of income or frequently irregular sources of income. And those people still need connectivity options. So we certainly do our best to serve all of those people who need low-cost connectivity options. And we'll continue to do so if we had the ability to do that without losing money.
A very important consideration. Let's talk a little bit about wholesale services, and here we're going to discuss duplication. We've heard from many parties that more facilities-based competition is unlikely to arise in the mobile market, given issues like large barriers to entry and the spectrum scarcity that we've just discovered. However, in your submission, in May of last year, you said you think that further facilities-based competition will arise from smaller existing companies if given the opportunity. And I wonder if you could expand on that a bit. What specific opportunities do you feel you need that the Commission could facilitate?
So spectrum is indeed a barrier. But I think that coming into the future, we'll see that millimeter wave spectrum may be less of a barrier. And we remain optimistic that ISED will undertake measures to make spectrum more accessible to us. And just as you heard from the gentleman who interviewed from Voyager Internet last week, there are a lot of members who are chomping at the bit. We would like very much to install a cell site or several cell sites in a community if we had the opportunity. The Commission isn't in charge of the spectrum currently, so the Commission isn't in a position to see that. But if we have opportunities to obtain spectrum, which we have seen we have some limited opportunities, we will go ahead and deploy that and build cellular access in these communities. Outside of that, we would like to continue to invest in our fixed networks, be they fiber build-outs or backhaul to various communities.
You've indicated that, in fact, it's sort of key to your intervention that you support Cogeco's hybrid MNO proposal because it would support the goals of enhancing competition and investment in telecommunications, in your view. And this was part of your July RFI response. Again, I realize that your members are quite small, but are any of them in a position to take advantage of the HMNO model at this stage? And who might they be? What specific areas would be served? How many Canadians do you think they could reach? That kind of thing.
I think that in the HMNO model, what we would see is much like the cable service providers that we're just making a presentation to you. There are local service providers, many of them cable cos, who would like to have the opportunity of selling their own mobile services in the communities where they're operating. So these companies would like very much to become an MVNO if they could. And they would also like to leverage that into investment into their own plant to build out the variety of services that they can offer their customers. These would be primarily small communities, to answer the second part of your question. Many of the communities that our members operate in have populations of anywhere between 150 people and 1,500 people. These are Some of them maybe up to 10,000 people, I would say. So these are small communities, and many of them are far away from the major centers, and many of them are currently poorly served by the national carriers.
How are they getting their service now?
Our members are a mix of, so some of them are cable cos, and some are fixed wireless providers. So offering fixed home internet through either their own cable plant or fixed wireless, and we have several members who have built out fiber services. The primary backhaul carrier in our province is TELUS, and most of our members would be buying their backhaul access and their connection to the larger, their upstream connection from TELUS.
Let's talk a little bit about the investment targets to maintain HMNO eligibility. You proposed that investment targets should be commensurate with revenues and that a minimum investment threshold could be set as a percentage of telecom revenue. What percentage do you think would be appropriate?
If I may, I'd like to take that as an undertaking.
Okay, right. Noted. The deadline for that is March the 10th.
Thank you.
Okay. You also propose penalties for failure to meet targets with the potential of revocation of access. What would those penalties be? Would they be similar? Would they be like our AMPs, our administrative monetary penalties, or would and subsequent to that, would those not create a disincentive to invest? Would people get gun shy?
You know, penalties certainly do create a disincentive to invest, however they're done. But if the Commission chooses to go the route of an HMNO type model, or a model similar to the ones that the Competition Bureau proposed, where you're going to tell companies that in order to enjoy MVNO access, you have to invest, the Commission should have some muscle to enforce that. And that does take the form of a penalty. The penalty, again, should be commensurate to the scale of the commitment that's been undertaken and the revenue that's been taken in through the MVNO access. For example, it would be unreasonable for a company to undertake to be an MVNO in a small community, open up a cell store in downtown Vancouver, make millions and billions of dollars from selling MVNO to Vancouver residents, invest nothing, and have no penalty for that. So there would indeed have to be some form of penalty, but it should be commensurate with the scale of the operation.
Do you really think that setting up an MVNO of any kind doesn't involve some kind of investment? I mean, none of these things are free. If someone got the opportunity to set up an NVO, whether they did as you just suggested or not, it's not going to come without some kind of cost to the entity that's attempting to get into this business, correct?
Absolutely. There's business risk, and there's investment in hardware, in network equipment, and there's tremendous investment into training and into the business process setting it up. So it's a significant undertaking for sure. Okay.
If the Commission did not mandate HMNOs, which you support, which of the other MVNO models that have been proposed would you favor? You mentioned the one supported by the Competition Bureau. Are there any others that you thought had some merit?
Our second choice would be the wider MVNO proposal of CNOC. Okay. We think the Competition Bureau's proposal is unduly limiting as to who could be an MVNO. Only relatively large companies with significant spectrum holdings would become MVNOs in that case.
Could you talk a little more about why mandating MVNO access at the Tier 4 level would be impractical? This is something you referred to in July. In your RFI response. Can you explain why?
Right. So I wouldn't assure you right off the bat that it couldn't be done because we don't operate a mobile network. But from the point of view of the operator that is selling us MVNO access, it may be difficult for them to limit the way that they sell us that wholesale access. I don't have the answer to that question. It's the short answer, but I want to make sure that I want to see that whatever the Commission mandates is practical to implement for the company that's providing us with the wholesale service. Otherwise, we'll be faced with an extra complication.
Your submissions indicated that you're proposing, it would appear, multiple levels of wholesale MVNO access. Can you confirm that you suggest a national level access for large MVNOs or an HMNO competitor, but only, say, provincial level access defined by area code for small regional HMNOs? And this again, this was part of your July RFI response.
We think that the scale of MVNO, in an HMNO framework, sorry, can we get the echo turned off the audio? Thank you. In an HMNO framework, the scale of wholesale access would be commensurate with the extent of the investment that the company is putting forward. So a company would, our members, for example, who are operating in a particular community, would primarily want to offer wholesale cellular access in that particular community. There's not really a practical reason for a member who's providing cellular and fixed service in Bella Coola, for example, to want to provide cellular service in Smithers. So we think that it would be appropriate to couple the two. Thank you.
Okay. Capacity. Some parties have suggested that one of the reasons MVNOs have not emerged in Canada is because there's not sufficient spare capacity available in the networks of the Canadian MNOs, and that as a result, MVNOs will be detrimental to network quality. However, you and others suggest that MVNOs will not significantly change the total number of customers using the networks. Can you talk about the concerns raised over the course of the hearing with respect to capacity?
Well, I think that in the communities that we serve where there's no cellular service at all, that we would certainly increase the number of cellular subscribers if we were able to construct a cell site. In the rural communities that we serve, we do not believe that the networks of the incumbents are over capacity or at capacity. These are not large communities. These are not generating a large amount of traffic. I have no doubt that on the metro at rush hour in Toronto or Montreal, that the network is at capacity. But at the network fringes, there should be capacity to serve additional customers. And I think that it would be very sensible for small operators to be able to access that.
And finally, let's talk about rates, terms, and conditions. You argued in your July RFI responses that wholesale rate setting has historically been ineffective due to complex pricing and processes, and that the Commission should strive for the simplest pricing model. Can you tell me a little bit more about what that ideal pricing model might look like?
So we've had a lot of discussions internally in the BC Broadband Association about mandated rates versus negotiated rates. And we did come to the conclusion that we think that a negotiated pricing model is better because we can come to terms and conditions and prices in a good commercial negotiation that would be suitable for all parties. Now, the Commission would need to provide significant incentive for the large carriers to engage in negotiations with us. And that's why we've suggested that some target of wholesale business would be appropriate, because if those carriers are indeed incentivized to open up their networks and have wholesale access, then they may engage in negotiations with us. in our experience with wholesale rates in the fixed wireline business, of course, as you know, there's a number of proceedings going on regarding fixed wholesale rates. These proceedings are going on they're taking a long time. It's many, many years before these rates are determined, and years after the fact, with the temporary rates in place, the Commission determines that the temporary rates are inappropriate or had been inappropriate. This delays investment. This makes doing business very difficult as a small, well, even as a large business owner, it makes doing business very difficult, and it doesn't provide us with the certainty or the margins that we need in order to invest in our businesses. So we think that the negotiated model would be better if it can be made to work.
Well, your experience has been that it took 2 years to negotiate with Rogers on something. Is that within the sort of realm of time that you think is appropriate, or
we think that
reasonable?
Was too long. We think that 18 months is certainly reasonable. These are complicated negotiations, and they will not be done very quickly. And mandating some sort of time frame may be good. Again, if the telcos are incentivized to engage in negotiations, if they have a strong stimulus to produce wholesale arrangements, then those negotiations may go quite a bit faster.
What can you suggest would be the incentives or the prod, if you like, to move things along and to incentivize them?
So we haven't given you a number, but we have suggested that the Commission might want to target a certain level of wholesale revenue. For example, that a certain percentage of a company's mobile revenues should come from wholesale services or wholesale traffic. It could be a graduated scale of penalties associated with not meeting those targets. But that sort of incentive might do the trick.
Are there any other suggestions you have for innovations that your membership could bring to the whole MVNO ecosystem, if you like? Are there specific things that you have in mind that they could do?
That's an excellent question that I wasn't prepared for, so thank you for that. Our members work very closely with businesses in the communities where we work. And many of these businesses do have unique needs, and many of these businesses are also quite small. So when one of these businesses would go to a large national carrier and suggest that they have a unique need for monitoring type systems, for a network extension to an area that's unserviced, these companies are too small to have that kind of conversation with a large national carrier. Whereas our members would happily have those sorts of conversations. What kind of monitoring services do you need? Where do you need these services? How do you want these services connected back to your head office network or interconnected between your various sites? These are the sorts of conversations that our members regularly have with businesses in our communities that those businesses are very pleased to have. So that's the sort of innovation that I think that our members and small internet service providers across Canada would be prepared to bring to these rural communities.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Levy.
Commissioner Leisner.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much.
Good afternoon.
Thank you so much for your presentation and the questions you've answered. I just had one question with respect to the incentive that you just described of mandating a minimum percentage of mobile revenues that have to be part of wholesale revenues as a means of getting negotiations to move more expeditiously or more successfully. In your research, have you seen any other jurisdiction where that approach has been adopted or adopted successfully? Or is this creative thinking on the part of the BCBA?
This is creative thinking on the part of our members. I'm not aware of any other jurisdiction where that sort of mandate has been undertaken.
Great. Okay, thank you. Good for you, thinking outside the box. Very good.
We're doing our best. Thank you.
Thank you. Those are all our questions. I thank you for taking the time to file and to answer our responses. It's very helpful. Council, any questions on your part? No? Then, Madame la Secrétaire.
This adjourns.
Thank you.
This adjourns the day. We will be back at 9 a.m. tomorrow morning. Thank you.
Thank you.